Good afternoon, everyone, and a warm welcome from me to the closing session. I think you already know who Hólmfríður Garðarsdóttir is, and you notice that I'm not her. She's supposed to chair, but I will just replace her for a while and let her rest until the end, when we will invite her here. And it is my pleasure to be with you and to have spent with you the last 2 days. I listened to many talks, presentations, and discussions during panels and in between. It's been a real pleasure, and I'm really delighted that the Vigdís International Center is co-host of this important conference. And we've been very much looking forward to it as one of our key events during this summer. And our center is one of the main institutions devoted to languages placed in this building. And this building, that is also called House of Vigdís, and known between the people like this. It's really exciting to hear taxi drivers and all people around like, who's Vigdís? Are you going there? It's not Veröld. For us, it's Veröld who's Vigdís, but it's really the House of Vigdís. And I just realized I maybe have to inform some of those who don't know who is Vigdís Finnbogadóttir, after whom our center and many other institutions and international prizes have been named. So she was President of Iceland from 1980 to 1996, the first democratically elected head of state in the world. And she has been advocate for many issues, including environmental issues, language rights, and learning languages as means for accessing and understanding other cultures. So because of this, after her presidency, she was named the one and only so far UNESCO Goodwill Ambassador for Languages. And a couple of decades after this, the Center for Multilingualism and Intercultural Understanding was opened here, and it's a small institution that operates under the auspices of UNESCO, and we have also the pleasure and responsibility to be involved in the recently launched International Decade of Indigenous Languages. So for those, and basically I just would like to inform you on this important initiative. I'm sure most of you have heard about the International Year of Indigenous Languages. That has sort of built a big network globally between mainly indigenous peoples, researchers, other allies, and of course the people who take decisions and other stakeholders at political level to launch the International Decade of Indigenous Languages. And this is now a UN initiative that is coordinated by UNESCO. And it is about indigenous languages, but it is as much as about indigenous peoples, because their languages and the historical development of their languages and language oppression, of course, represent intersection of historical processes, colonialization, discrimination, and so on. But the main focus of the decade is to help those who speak indigenous languages be proud of their languages, revitalize them, document them, develop teaching materials, and also introduce them in teaching or develop more teaching materials where they exist. Of course, there are different communities with different needs, and we are well aware of that. This is the website, the global website of the International Decade, and we have an Icelandic language website of it. And I'm sure that many people would not think of Iceland as a place where we engage with indigenous languages. And that's why we also think it's a good idea to speak here about languages. We have heard from indigenous peoples that Iceland is a sort of a good space because Iceland does not carry historical legacies of being a colonizer of indigenous peoples or other peoples for that matter. Also, we would like to see Iceland, and Iceland is seen as a space between continents, cultures, a multilingual space in general, but also we have heard since the very beginning of stepping in the decade that Iceland has experiences to share which indigenous peoples and other peoples participating in the decade would like to hear about, namely how a small language that is as endangered as other languages by, for instance, English language domination, how this language survives and what are the tools for maintenance and development of language, from documentation, using digital tools, and translations. And also, we represent Iceland as a state at the Task Force for Implementation of the Decade, and we're very happy that we have the support of different institutions. We see here the President of Iceland, who is also a speaker for small languages and for all languages for that matter, and their right to have a place in the digital reality and to be equal to all others. We also would like to raise awareness among this public here, the participants at the conference. I'm sure that most of you do not work with indigenous peoples or languages on an everyday basis, but it is a decade of everyone. So it's about being engaged, informed, aware, and respectful to others' languages. And then what we can all do. Apparently, I'm not a specialist on indigenous languages, but for instance, I'm a supervisor and one of the teachers in an MA course called Languages and Cultures. That was mainly focused on teaching modules on world languages, starting from Greek, Latin, Global English Today, Chinese, and so on. So we were teaching about languages that are mainly related to domination. Then we shifted the focus of the course, first by introducing modules related to language rights, minority languages, indigenous languages, historical overview of the terms indigenous peoples and languages, but also within the topics of, let's say, global English, we introduced a theme related to what happens to languages, indigenous languages on territories that are a sort of conquered by colonizers, and other language is introduced and becomes the dominant language, and languages are marginalized. So I think that everyone can do something, being by inviting indigenous person that can speak in many languages to your students, or just being aware of that. We've been collaborating with many indigenous peoples, mainly in the Arctic and Nordic region, and we had the pleasure to work since the very beginning of the international decade with Johan Sandberg McGuinne, who is here with us today. I will not say many things about who he is. I would like him to introduce himself because he has multi-layered identities. But I would like to say that he's one of the most engaging speakers with whom I have worked. And I invited him also as a speaker at the Languages and Cultures course. And this was the closing session for the students. And I thought the moment we ended up with really engaged discussions, so all the students had brilliant questions and comments and so on, I thought, okay, it's good that this was the last session, because I think students would not tolerate me as a teacher anymore after seeing Johan. So that said, it's a real pleasure to introduce Johan to you. Thank you. And I'll be back here after Johan's talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Sofiya. So my name is Johan Sandberg McGuinne, or Johan Gomach, ik Patrick, ik Joris, ik Hamish, ik Ian, or Sativarian Shrewlin, Joha, Amnasurf, and Joha. So my mother is South Saami and my dad is from Scotland, and that's the confused names. But I have always thought of it as a bit of a strength to be growing up in a family where languages were always there, and it was always a multilingual society around me in a way. But what was interesting in this type of society was that two of the languages that I grew up speaking and that I grew up speaking every day, those were dominant colonial languages, whereas two of the languages that I grew up with only barely had experiences that could be seen as coming from being minoritized or from being colonized, being Scottish Gaelic and South Saami. Now, with both of those languages, I had to work hard in order to reclaim them as my own languages. So in South Saami, we have a saying when we talk about our languages that I think is a nice one to share, especially to you as teachers, because it gives us another way of looking at languages. We talk about Gaelic famo. So Gaelic famo, it means language is power. Okay, that's one thing. But the second thing is vai mo Gaelic. So even if English and Swedish are the languages that I speak on a daily basis and that I feel the most comfortable in a way, the language of my heart, that's South Saami. That's my vai mo Gaelic. And I think instead of talking about heritage languages, which Ophelia Garcia so poignantly said, puts it in the past as something that is just historical, if we talk about it as the language of our heart, we understand it to be something that is always there, always very important for us. Now, I realize that some of you might know a lot about the Saami, some of you might not know anything. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk to you both as a teacher, as the president of the Saami Writers Association, and as a traditional musician. So I'm going to start by telling you a bit about the history of the Saami, who we are, a bit about the colonial history that we've gone through, and then I'm going to talk about how I work in the classroom with traditional music in order to pass on our language. So first of all, who are the Saami? Well, we are Europe's only officially recognized Indigenous people. Now, there are so many different ideas of what an Indigenous person is and what an Indigenous person isn't, but according to all the documents, we are the only officially recognized Indigenous people in Europe, which begs the question, what happened to Greenland? Because are we then saying that Greenland is North America? Once again, here we're talking about colonialism. And when we talk about colonialism in Europe, we tend to forget that just because we went away and colonized the rest of the world, we were quite busy doing it on our own home turf as well. Now, the ancestral homelands of the Saami, they cover an area which is quite big. I took the time to look and see how big is it actually, and it's roughly the size of, if you take the UK, you take Ireland, and you take Austria, and you put them all together, and that's Sápmi. So it stretches from, I would say, southern mid-Norway all the way to the Russian Kola Peninsula. So it's quite a vast area. And when I say the northernmost parts of Sweden, that's because that's what everyone wants to say. We're peripheral, we're on the outskirts of Europe. But the thing is that there have been finds now in recent days that show that the Saami were just as active around Stockholm as we were in the far north. So it's once again a question of perspective. How many are we? Well, we speak a lot of languages, and we're not that many, but we're somewhere between 100,000 and 250,000 people. Now, when I say that, the Swedish government, the Russian government, the Finnish government, and the Norwegian government, they start to feel somewhat stressed out because the Swedish government has, ever since the 1970s, said that there are 20,000 Saami in Sweden, meaning that there has never been anyone born after 1971, and no one has died. So it's quite remarkable. I'm 36, so I don't quite know how it works out, but that's the way it is. I'm going to show you a map now, and this is probably the most accurate map of Sápmi that I know of anyway, and it shows also the languages. So you see here that we start in the south, where it says, this is in Swedish, so it says Sydsamiska, which means South Sami, and then it goes into Umesamiska, Umesami, Piteåsami, Luleåsami, North Sami, and then these are the languages on the Swedish side, and then if we go into Finland, we get Skolsami, Inarisami, and then you have Ter, Akala, and Kildin Sami on the Russian side of the border, and Akala Sami just died out. I want to talk about erasure as a colonial tactic, because ever since Sweden started to colonize Sápmi, the country has used a number of different methods to strip us of our rights, and particularly in terms of land and sovereignty. And this has been very successful because it's easy to say that we don't exist if you create laws that take away our identity. Up until the 1960s, a woman who married a Sami reindeer herder became, according to the state, Sami, whereas a woman who married a Swedish man became Swedish. This is not how identity works. It's not a matter of marrying another person and then suddenly you don't exist anymore. But this was one of the ways that the Swedish government worked. And ever since 1928, on the Swedish side of the border, there's been a sharp, distinct line between reindeer herders and non-reindeer herding Sami. That's created a lot of the problems that we see today for Indigenous people in Sweden. There's also been a different school system for the Sami and for Swedish children, and it was quite a bad system with boarding schools where children were taken away and they were beaten for speaking their language. They couldn't go home to their families, and if they were from reindeer herding communities, they were only allowed a certain amount of years in school because they were only suitable to become reindeer herders, according to the state. And this went on for a long, long time, up until the 1960s. And we still talk about a loss of land, because we had what was known as Sami tax lands, but they were never something that we gave up. So these constitute what in Canada is known as unceded territories. But this is a term that, when used in Sweden, once again is very controversial. Now, let's talk about the languages, because that's why we're here. We're talking about languages. We say that we speak 9 languages. They're all part of the Finno-Ugric family. The most commonly used one is North Sami. And even smaller language communities, such as the Umesami one, are working really hard to bring back their languages. But when I say bring back our languages, it is because the state of our languages is quite dire. For my language, South Sami, depending on who the depressing person is who tells us how many speak our language, there's anything between 500 and, say, 1,200 speakers, making it one of the highly endangered languages of the world. And despite the fact that there has been a lot of new laws written, both in Norway and Sweden and Finland and so on, they don't really help us transmit the language, because without teachers, without intergenerational transmission, a language has it very hard to keep on being passed on. And this is problematic because for the Sami community, language constitutes our identity in many, many ways. We are our languages, and all the official definitions of Saminess are closely tied to the language, meaning that if you cannot document that your grandparents or their parents spoke a Sami language, you are excluded from voting in the Sami parliament. And with a language such as Umasami, with today perhaps somewhere between 80 and 100 active speakers, it's very easy to see what will happen to that community if their children aren't picking up the language. We talk about cultural norms, and those are embedded into our language. So there's an expression called "toimiesvuekja," which means a respectful way. Our language needs to be spoken in a respectful manner, and that is embedded into the words and everything. It constitutes an embodied situational type of knowledge that talks about the land, that talks about how we are supposed to act and behave towards other people. You can see it when you talk about the weather. You can see it, for example, one of my pet hobbies for the past couple of years has been collecting Sami words for snow. And last time I checked, 587 words. So we might have the most words for snow. If anyone wants to try me, then you're free to do so. But I think I win. But it means the reason why we have so many words for different things is because those have been important to us. It has been important to talk about weather. It has been important to talk about different natural phenomena. Now, I want to now move on to the next part, which is me talking about yoiking. So, what is yoiking? Well, yoiking is traditional singing. It constitutes what many scholars of music call the oldest musical tradition in all of Europe. And one of the first authors of Sami literature, he wrote a book in 1917, and he said, and I'm just going to read the quote to you, "Yoiking is a way of remembering. Some are remembered in hate and in love, while others are remembered in sorrow. These songs are also used about particular regions and about animals." And this is really what a yoik is, because a yoik, as much as you want to call it a song, it isn't. It functions more as a type of signature for a person, for a place, for an animal. When I yoik someone, I become that person. I give a voice to that person or that place. And because of that, yoiking is a type of cultural transmitter. It's one of our most important parts of our Sami identity, I would say. Without yoiking, a lot of us would feel quite lost. And yoiks function both as decolonial records of our history because they can tell us things about the past. There are several yoiks from the 1600s that talk about how colonial people came to our areas and forced Christianity on us or stole different important lands from us. But they're also a form of lyrical poetry. So for me, they are a great way of passing on knowledge to the future. They can function as a vehicle for intergenerational transmission because we can connect people on a deeper level. At the same time, we give our languages the space they need, because a yoik is interesting in that the melody is the most important thing. So you can do a yoik without words, because the melody is what carries the message, meaning that if you don't speak that much of the language, you can still be part of the yoiking tradition. But then by learning the language, you get deeper into the tradition. Now, people have said that yoiking, when it comes to person yoiks, they function as a form of musical names. And they can also be used as a type of mental therapy when we're working with elderly people who suffer from dementia. And it's also a way to pass on cultural values and ideas to young children. Now, yoiks, we say that yoiks come to us when something happens. I'm going to show you a picture of a man and then the lyrics to a yoik. And this man, he is from the Ran reindeer herding community. And one winter, not long ago, 2 years ago, he was out on the ice and he saw a reindeer that was drowning. And he knew that with one lasso, he wouldn't be able to catch it. So he tied two together. And one lasso is 30 meters. So that is probably something close to 60 meters. And everyone was saying, oh, this is not going to work. He's not going to manage. And he managed to catch the reindeer and he pulled it to shore, and it survived and it gave birth to reindeer calves that year. And that meant that a yoik came to me. So now I'm going to share what a yoik is so that I'm not just talking about it, but you can hear it as well. So, Varaiste son potset bergen av markjelmenet tolmatovje, wappen vilje hochestamme, ranet chefbje hochesteja, oyo, 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 Thank you. Now, and as you can see, the lyrics are very poetic. They're maybe not quite as poetic in South Saami because they're a bit more straightforward, but you know, when you translate something, sometimes it has to carry the music as well. Now, there are different traditions for yoiking, and we talk about Luahti in the north, Walle in the Lulu Sami area, Laud in the eastern Sami area towards Finland and Russia, and then my tradition is called the Vuelje tradition, or Velje if you speak Ume-Sami. And what's interesting about a yoik is that while you just saw me say that that was the lyrics for the yoik, if I meet this person and he annoys me, I can use the melody and I can change the lyrics. The lyrics are never set, meaning that they're perfect when you're teaching language because it forces you to be creative. You have the melody and then you can change it and you can invite people to come up with new ways of presenting something. So let's say that we have my sister's yoik, and my sister's yoik, the melody is just if I then want to add words to it, maybe one day she's very lazy and we're supposed to catch the plane. And then I go, I just use the language then to kind of force her to be a bit faster. So the creativity that you can have with yoiking is something that I really enjoy about our culture. It's not a song about something. It is a physical manifestation of the place of the person who's being yoiked. I have to say this over and over again because when we talk about it as singing, it's not quite that. Yoiking has also been tied to discrimination. I also need to look at the time because I can talk for years. Yoiking was considered to be a type of witchcraft. So when the church came to Saami, it was banned. If you were yoiked, you could be burned at the stake. And this happened to several people who were yoiking. But this also means that today many Sami have internalized this kind of hatred for the yoiking tradition. In Mats and Guavitegeno, two very strong North Sami communities where the language is the first language of the people, it still to this day is very controversial if you so much as suggest yoiking in church. You can yoik anywhere else, but don't take it into the church. Whereas in the South, it has become part of our reconciliation and repatriation process of bringing it back into the churches. But cultural assimilation has led to a drop not just in speakers of our languages, but also in yoikers. So my idea is that we try and bring both of it back. Because if we bring one of the things back, if we strengthen our community so that they know what yoik is, that they understand this as something important, then we can also bring back the language. And I think this is something we have to remember. Language is nothing if we turn it down into something that is commodified into something simple as, okay, I can do business with another country because I speak this language. Language is always culture, it's always identity. And yes, this can also cause conflicts, which we've seen in many different countries. But it is important to remember, language has to be something more than just something neoliberal, I think. So in the classroom then, what do we do? Well, I use yoiks in different ways. For example, there's a yoik that I start, the first yoik I always start and I teach my students, it's the reindeer calves yoik. It's a very beautiful yoik. It's a very simple yoik. The melody is very easy. Anyone can learn it. I've taught it to people all around the world. I could teach it to you. Yes, you will learn it. And the reason why I start with it is because obviously reindeer are connected to the Saami culture in a very strong way. Without reindeer herding, many people would not even know who the Saami were, and also a lot of our traditional trades and costumes and cultural oddities and beauties and whatever we want to call it would not exist. So I always start with the reindeer calves yoik, and I teach it first without words, so then they just have to learn the melody. So we start by going den bien. So valla na yo valla. And those are actually the words you need to know. Valla na yo valla. Because if you know valla na yo valla, and all of you can sing, am I right? Yes. Yes. Okay, so all of you can sing. And then you can also go valla na yo valla. And then obviously we can add the words, which are den bien dan smava mi sacha. But those are not important, because then we go on to the melody, and the melody is valla na yo valla, valla na yo valla, valla na yo valla, valla na yo. And then you just repeat that. So with the children we do this, and then we add the words. So den mien dans ma famia sacha na yo valla, valla na yo valla, valla na yo valla, valla na yo valla, valla na yo. And as you can see, it's just repeated. Na 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 na. And I think you can all try and do it with me. So I'll lead, and I just want to hear it. It will be nice to hear it in this space, because I think then it might just be because I have two microphones, but I really like the way it sounds in this room. So let's go. So it's valla na yo valla, valla na yo valla, valla na yo valla, valla na yo. Valla na yo valla, valla na yo valla, valla na yo valla, valla na yo. Well done. Well done. You're so good. You're so talented. And as I said, I teach children from the age of 5 to the age of 93. My oldest student was 93. Sadly, she passed away, and I think she was more my teacher than I her student. But it was still was still a very special thing to be able to have an elder in the classroom. Now, then we have yoiks that talk about different places, like Stwerravarie. And Stwerravarie is a mountain that many of the students that I teach are very familiar with because it's part of their traditional homelands. Now, we talk about Sápmi, but we're tied to different parts of Sápmi. So for me, the Umi River that I live next to, that I was born next to, that is my lifeline. So that is the yoik that means the most to me. If anyone were to say, could you just do a yoik, that's the first one I go to, because it is me. It's my culture. It's that which gives us life. But for most of my students, this mountain is that. It's a sacred mountain up in the Swedish mountains. And the lyrics, again, can obviously be changed, but there are lyrics that are traditional, that have been passed on since 1705 when it was first written down. So that yoik goes a bit like this. Stwerre varianuyna, stwerre varianuyna, Dalle stwerre varien vilja, dalle stwerre varien vilja. Alto miesie quatto minia, alto miesie quatto minia. And that mountain then becomes a part of their identity, and by being able to yoik it, they feel closer to it, and they understand why they should learn the language. Because obviously by learning the language, they can learn all these old traditional yoiks that talk about places and tell them what they look like before a hydroelectric dam just suddenly dammed their grandparents' village, or something, a mine destroyed a mountain that was important to their community. And then there are yoiks that are just about animals, and yoiks do not have to be beautiful. A very important example of that is this yoik. All the kids who are young, they love this yoik because they get to kind of scream, because the lyrics are also interesting. It is about the Arctic fox, but if you read them, white thief, the one who takes my reindeer calves from me, do you think we're talking about the Arctic fox, or are we talking about sweets? I mean, it's not like we're not white, but still. So that one, the lyrics go, as I said, like this, and the melody is very kind of hard and graining on the ear because it goes, and then it goes on. And all the kids, they love to be able to go and do that, because they can kind of play with it. The way we've used yoiks is that we've made it a point in making sure that our students, they get to record themselves when they make this. So some of them, they want to make CDs, and they get to make CDs. Nowadays it's Spotify, so let's not even pretend like it's CDs. But we put it on Spotify or SoundCloud, and they get to go to a studio, and they get to learn yoiks, and they get to make their own yoiks. And then sometimes we have people who are a bit more expressive. So a while ago, we had a group of students, teenagers, and they made a performance called Mo Beira. And what that was them bringing two Saami languages together, and they wanted to challenge prejudice and stereotypes about the Saami. And all of them, once they were part of this project, they stayed, and they have kept on studying language. So the people I will show you on the picture afterwards, they're very tiny, and nowadays they're 19, 20, and all of them have gone on to work with Sami language in one way or another. And it all started here because most of them were not studying any other languages before this. And we had 2 performances at culturally significant places in Sápmi, and we wanted to kind of challenge the majority by having them think about ideas and questions about indigeneity, identity and language, and we used the yoik as our way to do that. So we travelled around Sweden, and I brought these kids with me, which you'll see now. And back then, 13, and he's now 22. She was 15, 25, or something like that. So, but all of them now work with the Sami language. I should probably, pointing here doesn't help you, but he is a teacher like me. The guy behind him, he's a writer, he's an author about to publish his first book. And she works both as a teacher and as a traditional handicraft maker. So if I get someone to become a teacher of our language, I think that's a success. So these two are my kind of tickets to me feeling like I've done my job. But yoiking is also a symbol of cultural belonging. They root us in our communities. They are easily identifiable. When we talk about yoiks, everyone knows what it is in the Sami community. People who live close to the Sami know what a yoik is. Without knowing what a yoik is, they might not know the finer details of it, but they've heard yoiks. And because of that, they become easily identifiable parts of our identity. It's also part of our arippiamahto, our inherited knowledge, our intergenerational knowledge. It connects us with our ancestors. So I think that teaching yoiks is a way of bridging the gap towards a brighter future, not just for our languages, but for our identities and for Indigenous peoples. Children who learn to yoik together with other Sami children, they become part of something, of a larger community where both our languages and our culture is being appreciated. They see it as something worthwhile, something to invest in. When we bring back these old yoiks, like the Umi River yoik, which is 400 years old, we connect ourselves to our ancestors and we see that they are still there with us today. And even if discrimination is still part of what it means to be Sami and Sápmi today, I think yoiks help us to promote our culture in a positive way. And it is also the fact that many famous Sami artists today, they have gone on to use yoiks in music. This has made it something positive. And I think if we try to pull them apart, we will fail. I think if we want to bring back our languages and make them strong languages, we also have to bring back the yoiking. And because of that, I'm using it in the classroom. And that's what I had to share with you. And I hope you've learned something. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask them.